Chapter 10. What the Rise Brought. Mary's phone buzzed at 6:30 while she was still working sand out of one shoe on the porch steps, and she almost didn't answer it before she saw the name. "It's Marcy," she said, and put it on speaker before Nancy could even ask. "Please tell me you're near a television," Marcy said without preamble, her voice pitched somewhere between disbelief and pure delight. "Please. I need this to be happening somewhere other than just my own kitchen." "We're at an inn," Mary said. "There's a television in the parlor, I think. What on earth is happening?" "Blanchette," Marcy said, and let the name sit there a moment, doing all the work it needed to do. "The Rise. Tonight. 9 o'clock, Netflix. And I'm not making a single word of this up. I have the confirmation email from her forwarded to 11 different people already." Mary sat down hard on the porch step. The actual show. The one she was pretending to be researching. "The actual show," Marcy confirmed. Apparently, after everything that happened, after the kittens, after all of it, she wrote them a letter. An actual letter on paper, explaining she'd misrepresented her involvement previously, but that she'd been taking it seriously ever since, and would very much like a real audition. And they gave her one. And she made it. "She's on the show, Mary. Beverly Blanchette is a contestant on a real baking competition, and I need every one of you sitting in front of a television at 9 o'clock, or I will never forgive any of you." "We'll be there," Mary said, already laughing, already turning to find Nancy's eyes going wide over the porch railing. 9 o'clock. I promise." Patty, when Mary explained the situation at the front desk with the flat urgency of a woman who considered this non-negotiable, turned out to be entirely on board, and by 5 to 9 the inn's small parlor held not only the three gals but Patty herself, 2 guests from Ohio who'd been recruited on the strength of Mary's enthusiasm alone, and a bowl of popcorn Patty produced from somewhere with the speed of a woman who'd been waiting for an excuse. "Explain to me again who this is," Patty said, settling into the good armchair. "A woman we solved a small mystery with, back home," Carol said, which was, Nancy thought, a fairly generous summary of 18 days that had involved a disguise, a nail salon stakeout, and Beverly Blanchette announcing to a roomful of strangers that she was essentially invisible. "She adopted 2 kittens named after Julia Child and Gordon Ramsay," Mary added, and told us, with total sincerity, that if she was going to take baking seriously, she needed to commit to it properly. "And now she's on television," Patty said. "And now she's on television," Nancy confirmed. The episode opened on 8 contestants at 8 stainless steel stations, and it took less than 30 seconds for the camera to find Blanchette, standing very straight, wearing an apron so crisp it looked ironed, introducing herself to the room with the composed gravity of a woman who had waited her whole life for exactly this sentence. "My name is Beverly Blanchette," she said to the camera, to the judges, to what Nancy suspected was the entire viewing audience of Vero Beach, Florida. "I am 61 years old. I've never done this professionally, and I intend to surprise several people." "She's not wrong," Mary murmured. The challenge, when it came, was lamination, of all things, the exact skill Blanchette had spent weeks secretly timing in the back corner of a slice of Paris, and Nancy watched her work with the focus of a woman who had genuinely unglamorously practiced no shortcuts, no delusions this time, just hours of folding butter into dough until her hands knew it the way Mary's hands knew a steering wheel, or Carol's hands knew a text. Her pastry rose. It rose beautifully, in fact, layers visible even on the small television screen, a judge lifting a piece to the light and making a sound of real, unstaged surprise. "Look at that lift," the judge said. "Whoever taught you lamination taught you well." "Nobody taught me," Blanchette said, with the same dignity Nancy remembered from a nail salon 3 weeks and 1,000 miles away. I taught myself, in secret, in someone else's kitchen. It's a longer story than we have time for. The whole parlor erupted, Patty laughing so hard she had to set down her popcorn, the Ohio guests looking mildly bewildered but thoroughly entertained, and Mary wiping her eyes with the back of one hand, helpless. "She's going to win," Carol declared, with total confidence, 20 minutes before the episode's own judges had made up their minds. She did not win, in the end, that particular round. She came in second, beaten by a decorator half her age with a fondant swan Nancy privately thought was showing off. But when the episode closed on Blanchette accepting her elimination with more grace than Nancy had ever personally witnessed her produce, thanking the judges, thanking the show, and then turning to the camera to say, with the same unstudied sincerity she'd brought to a room full of strangers in a nail salon, "I would like to thank my cats, Julia and Ramsey, for their unwavering support and complete indifference." The whole parlor was on its feet. "I need to call her," Mary said, already reaching for her phone. "I need to tell her we watched. All of us. From Maine." "It's after 11 back home," Nancy pointed out. "She'll be awake," Mary said. "She just finished being on television. Nobody sleeps after that." She was right. Blanchette answered on the second ring, breathless, delighted, already talking before Mary had gotten a full sentence out, and the parlor settled back into its chairs to listen to one half of a conversation that needed, apparently, no other half at all. Mary laughing, Patty refilling the popcorn, the whole small room warm with a kind of happiness that had traveled a very long way to find them. "We should have brought her fudge," Carol said into the general contentment. "From the giant squirrel place. I feel we've missed an opportunity." "We'll bring her fudge when we get home," Nancy said. "She earned it tonight. Second place to a professional fondant swan is nothing to be ashamed of." She didn't sound ashamed, Mary said, phone still pressed to her ear, listening to whatever Blanchette was saying with an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy. She sounded like a woman who finally got the thing she'd been pretending to already have. I don't think there's any shame left in her at all. Outside, the harbor had gone fully dark, the last of the day's boats in for the night, and Nancy sat back in her chair with a piece of popcorn she didn't particularly want, thinking that this, too, was exactly the kind of thing worth remembering about this trip. Not just the whales and the granite, and the mystery waiting for them 3 days up the coast, but a parlor full of near strangers cheering for a woman none of them had ever met 400 miles south, becoming, on television, precisely who she'd always claimed to be. Chapter 11. What the Deep Water Held. "We never did use that brochure," Carol said over breakfast, with the dry tone of a woman raising a grievance she had been quietly nursing for days. "The whale watching one. Patty pressed it into my hands the very first afternoon, and I've been carrying it around in my bag like a promise nobody's kept." "You can't even read the brochure," Nancy pointed out. "I can feel that it exists, which is worse. It's been reminding me of its existence every time I dig for a tissue." So they went, the 4-hour excursion out of the town pier, a boat considerably larger than Owen's brother-in-law's skiff, with real seating below and a snack bar and a naturalist aboard whose entire job, apparently, was narrating the ocean to a boatload of tourists with the tireless enthusiasm of someone who had never once tired of the view. A deckhand ran through the safety talk before they cleared the harbor. Life vests under every bench, orange, not red, the good, boring, modern kind, with the reflective tape, and Nancy found herself noting the color the way she'd apparently taken to noting most things lately, filing it without deciding to, the way you file away a word you don't expect to need again. "We're heading out toward Mount Desert Rock," the naturalist announced over a crackling PA, a young woman in a park green fleece with binoculars permanently around her neck, about 26 miles offshore, which puts us past the continental shelf edge where the deep water starts. That's where the whales feed this time of year, on the last of the season's krill before everybody heads south. The crossing out was rougher than the ferry to Skudik had been, the boat's bow rising and falling over long Atlantic swells with a rhythm that made Mary go faintly green and grip the rail with both hands, while Carol, delighted, tipped her face into the spray and declared it considerably better than any amusement park ride I've been forced onto by well-meaning grandchildren. A claim nobody had context for and nobody asked her to explain. "There!" the naturalist called out less than an hour in, pointing off the port side, and half the boat surged toward the rail at once. "Blow at 10 o'clock. That'll be a finback, by the shape of it. Second largest animal on the planet, after the blue whale." Nancy watched the spout rise, a sudden white plume against the gray water, followed a moment later by the long dark curve of the whale's back breaking the surface, impossibly vast, impossibly unhurried, gone again beneath the water almost before her eyes had finished believing it. "Mary," she said, "you're missing it." "I'm not missing it. I am considering my own mortality," Mary said, from her position bent nearly double over the rail. Though when the second blow came, she straightened despite herself, one hand still braced against the boat's roll, and watched the whale's back roll through the water with an expression that made the seasickness look, briefly, entirely worth it. "What does it sound like?" Carol asked, her hand tight on the rail beside Nancy, her whole body angled toward the water like a compass needle. "A sound like a door opening," Nancy said, trying, and then this huge, wet exhale, like the ocean itself breathing out, and then it's just gone, like it was never there at all. Carol nodded slowly, filing that away the way she filed everything worth keeping. "It sounds bigger than it looks," she said after a moment. "Not louder, bigger." Nancy considered that. "Yes," she said. "Exactly." The naturalist made her way through the crowd a few minutes later, a flat, dark, fringed plate about the length of a forearm held out in both hands. "Baleen sample, if anyone wants to feel it," she called. "This is what they filter their food through instead of teeth. Real whale baleen, donated from a stranding years back." Carol's hands found it before anyone else's, turning it slowly, running her thumb along the fringed edge where it frayed into something almost like coarse hair. "It's stiffer than I expected," she said. "Like a fingernail almost, but it splits into these fine bristles along the side. You could filter an ocean through this and never even feel it working." "That's more or less exactly what it does," the naturalist said, clearly delighted to have found in this particular passenger someone actually listening. "Keratin, same stuff as your own fingernails, just grown into these long plates instead. A whale this size might have 300-400 of them lined up in its mouth. 400 fingernails standing in a row catching breakfast," Carol said, handing it carefully back. "I don't think I'll ever eat a sandwich the same way again." The naturalist kept up a steady stream of facts as the boat idled, engines cut, everyone straining for the next surfacing. "Finbacks can hold their breath for 20 minutes, sometimes longer. They're baleen whales, so instead of teeth, they've got these long plates that filter krill and small fish right out of the water. An adult can eat close to 2 tons a day this time of year, fueling up before winter." 2 tons, Carol repeated, delighted. "I have never respected an appetite so completely." "You'd get along," Nancy said. They saw 3 more whales before the boat turned back toward shore, one close enough that its exhale carried across the water as a low, wet huff that made Carol gasp aloud, and a pod of harbor power puss running alongside the hull for a stretch, quick, dark shapes cutting the water in perfect unison, gone as fast as they'd appeared. "I want to go home and tell everyone I met a whale," Carol announced, once they were seated below decks again, wrapped in the blankets the crew handed out against the cold, her cheeks wind-burned and her whole face lit with the satisfaction of a woman who had gotten exactly what she came for. "I did not meet a whale. I heard one breathe from 400 yards away, and I am prepared to represent that as a personal encounter to anyone who asks." "Nobody's going to fact-check you," Mary said, color slowly returning to her own face now that the boat had turned and the ride home ran with the swells instead of against them. "I should hope not. I've earned some creative license after that crossing." Nancy, watching the coastline slowly resolve out of the haze ahead of them, Bar Harbor's rooftops and the mountains behind it coming back into focus, found herself thinking that this was exactly the kind of day the trip had promised months ago, when she'd first read the sweepstakes email out loud at the Green Marlin, and none of them had believed it was real. Whales and popovers, and a giant fiberglass squirrel and a state that smelled like something she hadn't known she was missing. She had no way of knowing, watching the empty gray water where the finback had last surfaced, how much further out to sea the real currents of this trip were about to pull her, or how little of it would have anything at all to do with whales. Chapter 12. The Quiet Side. The 9 o'clock ferry left from the Bar Harbor Inn pier, which was a 10-minute walk from the inn, which meant leaving at 8:45 at the latest, which meant breakfast at 8, which meant Nancy had already been up for an hour and a half by the time Mary appeared in the doorway of their shared room, still in her robe, holding her travel mug and squinting against the morning light. "The ferry leaves when it leaves," Mary said, "whether or not I have finished my coffee." "This is true," Nancy agreed. "It will leave at 9 o'clock, specifically. That was not an invitation to tell me what time it leaves." Carol, already dressed and sitting on the edge of her bed with Nina's old collar looped once around her wrist, the way she did most mornings when she wanted something small and familiar to hold on to while the day organized itself around her, said, without looking up, "We'll make it. We always make it." "Because I plan ahead," Nancy said. "Because the universe rewards Carol's optimism," Carol said serenely, and went to find her shoes. A deckhand caught the heavy dock line as they came down the ramp, looping it in one practiced motion around a squat iron cleat bolted into the pier, and Carol, close enough to reach it as they filed past, ran her fingers over the taut rope before it was tied off. Thick, coarse, faintly damp, the individual strands twisted hard against each other in a way that felt, under her palm, less like rope and more like something braided out of wood. "That's a cleat hitch," the deckhand said, catching her interest. "Holds better under load than it looks like it should. Whole boats trusting itself to a knot you could untie with 2 fingers, if you knew which end to pull." A crackling PA came on overhead as they found seats along the rail, a young voice reciting the same safety announcement it had clearly recited 1,000 times that season. Life preservers stowed under the gunwale on both sides. Restrooms below decks. Please keep small children away from the rail, and Nancy, listening with half an ear, filed the word gunwale away without quite noticing she'd done it, the way you file away any word you expect never to need again. They made the ferry with 12 minutes to spare, which Nancy noted and neither of the others commented on, and stood at the rail as it eased away from the pier into the morning light on Frenchman Bay, the harbor falling back behind them, the whole of Bar Harbor arranging itself into something small and pretty and pleasingly distant. The crossing took 45 minutes, and all 3 of them were quiet for most of it the way that water does to people. Something about the movement and the scale of it, the way the bay opened up once they cleared the harbor mouth, the islands rising out of the water with their dark tree lines, their granite cliffs the color of old bone. A small lighthouse stood on a low island to their right, white and red, its beam still cycling even in daylight, and the ferry's wake drew a long white line back toward Bar Harbor until the harbor itself blurred into the tree line, and the mountains rose gray-green behind it. "There," Mary said, pointing, though Carol couldn't follow the point and didn't need to. "A whole family of seals, hauled out on that ledge. 6, 7 of them just lying there like they own the rock. One's got its head up watching us." "Harbor seals," the man in the wool cap offered without turning from the rail. "You'll see plenty of them this stretch. Curious things. They'll follow a boat sometimes, just to get a look at you looking at them." Somewhere off toward the near shore, a long, wavering cry rose up and hung in the cold air, half wail and half laugh, and Carol went still the instant she heard it, her head turning sharply toward the sound. "What was that?" she said. "That is the strangest, most beautiful thing I have heard since we landed in this state." "Loon," the man said, and something in his weathered face softened at the sound the way it hadn't for anything else all crossing. "They're coming off the inland lakes about now, working their way out to the salt water for the winter. That call carries for miles over open water. Always has. My grandfather used to say it was the loneliest sound God ever made and the most honest one, both at once." Carol didn't say anything to that. She simply stood at the rail with her face turned toward open water, listening for it to come again. And when it finally did, fainter this time, farther off, she smiled the way she smiled at very few things, entirely to herself, entirely satisfied. "Lobster boats," Carol said, tilting her head. She couldn't see them, but she'd heard the engine pitch shift as they passed something at low speed. "How many?" "3, Mary said. "No, 4. One more back toward the island. They're hauling traps. You can see them pulling the buoys up. Those bright-colored markers in the water." "What colors?" "Orange and yellow on the nearest one. Red and white on the one behind." Mary paused. "The man hauling is wearing the kind of raincoat that means he's been wearing it for 20 years. It's the exact color of something that used to be orange." "That's a lobsterman's raincoat," a man nearby said, not unpleasantly. 60s, wool cap, the look of someone who knew this crossing well. "Don't buy a new one till the old one gives out, and those things last forever." "Do you fish?" Mary asked. "Did. 40 years, mostly out of Winter Harbor." He nodded toward the Schoodick shore growing ahead of them. "Retired now." He didn't say it the way most people said retired, with the mild satisfaction of a chapter closed. He said it the way you said a word that still didn't quite fit in your mouth after all this time. "Wife keeps saying I ought to enjoy it. Dog agrees with her. Old fella like me's got nothing left to prove out there, she says. And she's not wrong. But you spend 40 years reading that water every morning, and it doesn't stop asking you to, retired or not." "What's it like over there now?" Nancy asked. "We're told it's the quiet side." The man considered this, in the way of someone deciding how much of the truth to give to strangers on a ferry. "Quieter than Bar Harbor," he said finally. "Working quiet. Good quiet mostly." He looked across the water a moment, at the lighthouse coming clearer now, the trees behind it thickening on the shore. "Though there's money moving in wants to make it a different kind of quiet. Buy a fella out, buy the next fella out." He shrugged, the way a man shrugs at weather. "Some'll sell, some won't. Ones that won't are the ones worth meetin'." He was quiet a moment, then added, almost to himself, "My own family had a hand in how that shore got divided up, generations back. Old paperwork nobody's looked at twice in 80 years. I could tell you some stories about it, if anybody still cared to ask. Folks used to." He said it without elaboration, turned back to the rail, and that was the end of the conversation. Though Mary, watching him watch the shore, thought it was not nearly the end of what he'd meant. The free shuttle met them at the Skoyodik Marine Center, a cheerful driver in an Island Explorer vest who announced stops in a practiced sing-song, and they rode it into the village of Winter Harbor proper before asking to be let off near what the driver called the old part of town, meaning the stretch of road that ran along the inner harbor, the one with the Lobster Co-op and the marine supply, and the diner with its door propped open and the smell of bacon and coffee drifting out to meet the salt air. A trim little boat sat up on blocks in a side yard along the way, hulls scrubbed and waiting on a fresh coat of paint, and a woman weeding a flower bed nearby called over, friendly, when she caught them looking. "That's my father-in-law's old boat. Can't bring himself to sell her, though he hasn't fished a day since his knees gave out." She nodded at a pair of life vests hung to dry on the porch rail, bright pumpkin orange, the newer kind with the reflective strips. "Bought those for the grandkids last summer. Thought they'd get him back out on the water for an afternoon at least. Vests still got the tags half on. Man's stubborn as the tide." Herrick's Cove was 3 miles further along the coast road, past a blueberry barren that stretched back from the road in low, rolling waves of brilliant crimson. The leaves had turned completely, the whole barren the color of a lit match, and a stretch of spruce that pushed in close on both sides until the trees cleared and the cove opened up below. A shallow natural harbor, half a dozen lobster boats moored in it, a dock with traps stacked in neat towers and buoys hanging in bright clusters from the pilings, and a small collection of buildings arranged around the head of the cove with the slightly sideways logic of a village that had built itself to suit the land rather than any plan. Nancy had borrowed one of the inn's bicycles. Mary and Carol had not. "I'm walking," Carol had said when Nancy mentioned it. "I walk. It's how I see things." So Nancy walked her bicycle, which somewhat defeated the purpose, but the road was pretty enough that none of them minded. The village had a post office the size of a large closet, a marine supply store, a small church with a hand-lettered sign advertising a chowder supper on Saturday, and a bait shop with a handwritten open sign that looked like it had been handwritten some years ago and had not been changed since. But it was the building at the far end of the harbor, new where everything else was weathered, that stopped them. It sat a little apart, on the good deep-water end of the pier, low-roofed and functional, the kind of structure built to do a job rather than look like anything. The dock in front of it was clean and hard-edged, newer than the rest of the pier in the way of recent money spent on infrastructure rather than affection. And above the door, large letters in a sans-serif font that had never been near a fishing village before in its life: Garrett Co. Premium Seafood, Skoyodik Peninsula, Maine. Below that, in smaller text, Established 2023. Mary read it aloud. Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They put the year." "They put the year," Nancy confirmed. "The co-op," Carol said, "did not put the year on its sign." "The co-op," Mary said, "didn't need to." A man came out of the marine supply store, late 50s, canvas jacket, the rolled-up sleeve energy of someone who'd been working since well before they arrived, and registered their presence at the sign with the expression of someone who had watched this moment happen dozens of times and had not yet found a version of it that didn't irritate him. "First time on the Skoyodik side?" he asked. "First time in Maine," Mary said. He nodded, the way people nod when they're deciding whether to say the thing they were going to say. "That fella," he said, jerking his chin at the sign, "came back after 25 years away with money made doing something nobody around here understands, and decided he was going to modernize the industry." The word modernize arrived with a weight on it that made clear he found it approximately as welcome as a jellyfish in a trap. Built his own pound, undercuts the co-op on price, buys up licenses when a man gets tired or gets old. 2 more sold to him last spring. "And the ones who won't sell?" Carol asked. The man looked at her, or in her direction, adjusting the way most people did once they caught the angle of her cane, the position of her attention. "He's patient," he said. "He can afford to be. Waits for a bad season, a bad back, a fella whose stern man quit. Peels 'em off the co-op one at a time. Better price this year, and next year when he's the only buyer left, we'll see about the price." He tucked a coil of line under his arm. "Whole thing holds together on 2 men not selling. Herrick, out at the head of the cove, his people have hauled that ground 200 years, and Greenleaf, Junior, 3 moorings down from him. Long as those 2 hold, the rest of us hold. They go. The co-op goes, and then it's Garrett's price or nothing." He nodded toward a modest house up the hill, wash flapping on a line strung between 2 spruce. Junior's wife keeps a dog that near takes your arm off in friendliness alone if you ever walk that road. Big fool of an animal. Neither of them'll hear a word against him. 2 men, Carol said. That's a lot to rest on 2 men. Nancy said nothing, but she was listening the way she used to listen to a caller building toward the real reason they'd dialed. The pattern underneath the words, not the words themselves. Peel them off one at a time. Wait for the bad season, the bad back, the sternman who quit. It was, she thought, exactly the shape of a certain kind of patient cruelty she'd heard described 100 times down a phone line, dressed up in business language instead of the uglier words it deserved. They're the right too. Something almost like a smile crossed him, then didn't quite last. Mind, you'll not catch 'em admitting they're on the same side. Herrick and Junior'll bicker over a lobster pot like 2 dogs on one bone. Been going at each other 40 years. He shrugged. That's just how it is with those 2. You want to see how it used to be done before the year got put on the sign? Go find Herrick. Ask anyone. They'll point you to Dickie. He said the name the way you say the name of a landmark and went back inside. "Dickie," Carol repeated, trying the word, filing it. "I like a village where the man you're told to meet is a person and not a sign." "There's more," Mary said, reading her phone now. The way she read most things she'd already half decided. "There's an old cemetery up the hill past the barren. The Herrick plot's the oldest part. Stones back to the 1780s. She looked up. "Same name as the man at the head of the cove." "Same ground 200 years, Nancy said. It would be. "We could go up tomorrow," Carol said. "I'd like to do rubbings, if the stones are old enough. The texture is the best part." "Tomorrow," Mary agreed. "The cemetery tomorrow." She looked down the length of the dock toward the head of the cove, where a broad-shouldered shape was moving on the deck of a moored boat, unhurried, at home, too far off to call to. "But the man today, I think. While the light's good." So they walked toward the head of the cove, where a broad-shouldered man in a black work jacket had lifted himself from the planks and stood at the edge of the wharf, watching them come. Chapter 13. The Living Museum. The wharf at the head of the cove smelled like the inside of the sea's pockets, brine and diesel and the cold green rot of bait, which Nancy decided she did not hate as much as she'd expected to. Carol's cane found the wharf boards before the rest of her did, tapping out a rhythm that told her something about their age long before anyone said a word. Uneven, some soft with rot, others worn to a silvery smoothness underfoot that felt, when she crouched to press her palm flat against one, less like wood at all than something closer to bone, salt-cured and hollowed by decades of boots. A coil of rope sat looped over a piling nearby, and she let her fingers trail across it as they passed, heavier than the ferry's dock line, crusted stiff in places with dried salt, a rough white bloom of it clinging to the fibers like frost that had forgotten to melt. "Mind the ramp," a voice called down. "She's steeper than she looks at low tide." The man at the top was built like something that had been left out in the weather on purpose and improved by it. 70, maybe more, with broad, scarred hands and knuckles enlarged by a lifetime of rope, wire, and cold water. He did not come down to help them, which Mary respected immediately. He simply waited and let the tide be the tide. "Richard Herrick," he said. "Everybody calls me Dickie." He looked them over. 3 women who'd been told in the village to come find him and did not perform delight, which was somehow better than if he had. "You'll be the ones asking after how it used to be done." "We'll be the ones," Nancy agreed. She found herself, without quite deciding to, reading him the way she'd once read 1,000 voices down a phone line. Not for what he said, but for the plain, unhurried honesty underneath it, the total absence of anything performed. 30 years had taught her to hear the gap between a person's words and their meaning almost before they'd finished a sentence, and she found, standing on his wharf in the cold morning light, that she was hunting for the gap in Dickie Herrick and simply not finding one. It was, she thought, a rare enough thing to notice. Something enormous and black rose from the planks behind him, unfolded to the size of a small horse, and ambled to the edge to inspect the newcomers. "That's Bowie," Dickie said. "He won't hurt you. Might lean on you. He's a Newfoundland. He figures anybody near the water needs saving, so don't fall in unless you want company." Carol put her hand out flat and let the great head press into it. "Oh," she said softly, "you're a serious dog." Bowie leaned. Carol did not so much as rock. "He weighs more than I do." "140, Dickie said with the plain pride of a man reporting a fact. He showed them his world the way other men showed photographs. The traps first. Mary crouched at one before he could offer, running her hand along the frame with the ease of someone remembering, not learning. "Now these," she said, "the kitchen's here, and the parlor's back through the—" She stopped, frowned at the material under her fingers. "This isn't oak." "No, ma'am," Dickie almost smiled. "Wire now. Vinyl coated. Wood went out before you'd want to hear how long ago." He didn't correct her the way a small man corrects a woman. He corrected her the way one craftsman tips his hat to another who's been away from the bench. "Principle's the same as you're saying, though. Kitchen, parlor. They come in to eat, they head for daylight, they end up where they can't." Mary sat back on her heels, unbothered, delighted. "I learned it on wood." "Then you learned it right," Dickie said. "It's just the wood that quit." Nancy watched her friend B, briefly, 30 years younger and closer to home than she'd been in decades, and said nothing, because some things you don't step on. She was tied at the float below them. Lil Miss Lois. White, gone the soft gray of weather, her name in a careful hand that had clearly been repainted more than once. A red life preserver hanging from a hook at the stern, its strap worn pale where a thumb had checked it evening after evening, more times than anyone would ever think to count. "Before I let you aboard," Dickie said, "let's see what you know. Anybody tell me the front end from the back?" "Bow and stern," Nancy said, with the flat confidence of a woman who was right and knew it. "Good. Which is which?" "Bow's the pointy one." Dickie allowed that this was technically correct. "Sides?" Mary hesitated. She knew. Nancy could see she knew. But she was hedging, the way she'd been hedging all week about how much of this coast still lived in her. "Port and starboard," she said finally. "Port's the left." A beat. "If you're facing the bow, how do you keep 'em straight?" "Port and left both have 4 letters, Mary said, and looked faintly pleased with herself. "That's the one." Dickie turned to Carol, not unkindly, the way you include the person everyone else is quietly deciding to leave out. "And you? Come feel her." He walked Carol's hand along the hull, and she went slowly, reading it, until her fingers found the top edge of the side and stopped. A long, smooth, rounded rail, the paint worn clean off it and the wood beneath gone pale and satiny. "Now that," Carol said, "is the nicest part. It's like—" She searched and reached, as she always did, for the truest word she owned, which came from houses and not from boats. "The wainscoting. The rail that goes round a room so the chairs don't mark the wall. You rest against it." She waited to be told she was wrong. "Not far off," Dickie said, and there was something new in his voice, a man surprised into respect. "That's the gunnel. Say it gunnel, never mind how it looks, and you're right about the resting." He put his own hand down beside hers on the worn place, and the two of them stood there a moment with their hands on the same smooth wood. 40 years, I've braced my hip right here to haul. That's why she's bald just there. Wears the paint off, the wood, everything. Body finds the one spot and keeps it. "You made that," Carol said quietly, "with just standing there." "With just standing there," Dickie agreed. He passed the brass gauge hand to hand, Carol last and longest, and showed them the notch he cut in the right rear flipper of every egg-bearing female before he put her back over the side. "V-notch," he said. "Cut her right here. Means she's a proven mother. After that, nobody can keep her, not me, not anybody down the coast, for the rest of her life. She's spoken for." "You mark her so you'll lose her," Nancy said. "I mark her so everybody loses her," Dickie said. "That's the whole point. You take the ones you can, and you put the future back in the water." He said it without weight, the way you'd give directions. "Man who takes everything's got one good year and 40 bad ones behind it. You take a little less than you could. Then it's still here." Nancy thought, but did not say, of a bright new sign at the good end of the pier with somebody else's name on it, and the year they'd started counting from. The tank was a battered box of running seawater, and it was where he'd been saving the surprise. "Now this one," Dickie said. "I've had a few days. Should have gone already." He reached in without ceremony and lifted out a lobster, and Nancy actually heard Mary's breath go. It was 2 lobsters. That was the only way her eye could hold it at first. Split straight down the middle, nose to tail. One half the ordinary bruised green-brown, the other half a deep, impossible orange. The line between them as clean as if it had been drawn. "Split her right down the keel," Dickie said. "Female on one side, male on the other. 2 halves of one animal the whole way down." He turned it gently in the light. "Fella at the college told me it's about 1 in 50 million. I've hauled 60 years, and it's the first I've seen. Probably the last." "You caught it days ago," Mary said slowly. "You could have sold her to a collector, sure." He said it mildly. "Goes to the aquarium down Booth Bay tomorrow where anybody can look at her. Kept her here so you 3 could see her first." He shrugged, embarrassed by his own kindness. "Seemed a waste, a thing like that, and nobody about to enjoy it." "Can I?" Carol said, and stopped, because she never asked to hold things. "Give me your hands," Dickie said. He set it across her palms and told her quietly, where the line ran, "Here's where she changes. Feel the claws bigger on the one side." And Carol went very still, the way she did in front of the things that mattered, holding a miracle she would only ever see with her fingers, and getting, everyone understood without saying it, the better end of the deal. The only sour note came across the water. A second boat had come in down the wharf, not a lotta, faded letters, and the man aboard it, and Dickie traded something that wasn't quite friendly, about pots and territory and who'd been where he oughtn't. It had teeth in it. Nancy filed it. The 2 of them plainly didn't get on. "Junior," Dickie said when the other man had thumped off up the ramp. He said it the way you say a thing you're tired of. Then, unexpectedly, almost to himself, "Known him 40 years. He didn't explain it, and they didn't ask, and the afternoon closed over the moment like water. At the top of the ramp, Boy leaned his whole enormous weight against Carol one more time, as if he'd decided she was the one most likely to go in. "He likes you," Dickie said. "He has taste," said Carol. Dickie almost laughed. They'd hear later that he wasn't a man who laughed easy, and lifted one broad-weathered hand as they went. "You three go poking around up there. You find an old bottle or a bit of wire glass along the wall, take it," he said. "Herricks have been pulling things out of that ground since before I was born. Just leave the burying ground be. Nothing comes out of there." "We will," Mary said. Dickie lifted one hand again as they went. Chapter 14. What the Stones Keep. The walk up to the burying ground took them along a stretch of old rock wall, fieldstone stacked without mortar the way it had been for 2 centuries, and it was Carol, running her cane along the base of it out of habit, who found the first piece of glass. "There's something here," she said, crouching, working a finger into the moss where the wall met the ground. Round, ribbed, cool, but not like a stone. Mary crouched beside her, wedged into a gap between 2 fieldstones, half swallowed by moss and the rotted stub of what had once been a wooden fence post driven in alongside the wall, sat a glass insulator. Squat, ridged like a beehive, the glass gone a deep, unmistakable violet. "An old line insulator," Mary said, working it free with careful fingers. "Telephone or telegraph, probably, strung along this same wall, back when they ran wire along fence lines instead of putting up separate poles." "What color?" Carol asked, turning it once in her palm before Mary could offer. "Violet. Deep violet, almost like a plum that's not quite ripe." Mary turned it toward the light. "It didn't start that color either. It's the manganese in the glass. They used it to make the glass clear, and instead, over enough years in the sun, it does this. UV does something to it nobody making the glass ever intended. The older a piece is, the deeper the color, usually. It takes a long time in the sun for the color to come up like that. This one's had plenty of both sun and time." "So the sun did this," Carol said, running her thumb along one of the ribs, "to something that was supposed to stay clear forever. That's about the size of it. I like that better than I probably should." "Following the wall because the wall was already there," Mary went on, straightening, brushing off her knees. "Somebody's property line doing double duty as somebody else's road for the wire. Whole coasts laced with these old roots if you know to look. Lines that don't go anywhere anymore. Roads nobody drives. Walls that used to matter and now just sit here holding up moss." "Can we keep it?" Carol asked. Nancy looked back down the empty road, then at the old post stub, soft and gray with rot. "It isn't from the burying ground. Dickie said anything along the old wall was fine." Mary laid her hand on the top stone. "Remember? He said the Herricks had been pulling things out of this ground since before he was born." Nancy nodded once. "Then it's yours." Carol tucked it carefully into her jacket pocket, cradling it there a moment longer than strictly necessary, and they went on up the hill. The cemetery was where Mary had said it would be, from the reading she'd done back at the inn. Up a short rise past the blueberry barren, behind a low stone wall the color of old bone, with a stand of sugar maples at its back that had gone so deeply red they looked almost black against the gray October sky. A hand-lettered sign on the gate, faded to near illegibility, read, "Herrick Family Bearing, Ground East, 1782. Please show respect." "Well," Nancy said, looking at the sign, "that's clear enough." The gate had no lock, just a length of wire looped over a post, and Mary undid it carefully, the way you did with things that had been doing their job long enough to deserve consideration. Inside, the oldest stones were slate, thin, dark, the lettering still surprisingly sharp after 2 centuries, though the winged skulls carved above the inscriptions had gone abstract from weathering, more suggestion than image. The newer ones, from the mid-1800s onward, were marble, and those had fared worse. The marble had softened and blurred, names half erased by rain and frost and time's particular indifference to the things people meant to last forever. Carol moved between the 2 kinds before she'd read a single word of either, one hand flat on a slate stone and then the other flat on a marble one beside it, comparing. "This one's still got its edges," she said of the slate, tracing a carved line that stayed crisp and sharp under her fingertip despite its age. "Sharp enough to catch a nail. But this," she moved to the marble, "feels like it's been left out in the rain 100 years because it has. Soft, rounded, like the stone itself is trying to forget what it used to say." She considered that a moment. The old ones are keeping their secrets better than the new ones. That seems backwards somehow. "The winged skulls," Mary said, crouching before one of the oldest stones. "I read about these. The Puritans used them. The skull represented death of the body. The wings represented the soul's flight. They called it the Death's Head." "Show me one," Carol said, and Mary guided her hand to the carving, and Carol traced the shape of it slowly, wing and skull, and the crude, worn lines between them. "It's rougher than I expected," Carol said. "Not fine work. Whoever cut this wasn't trained for it." "A lot of them weren't this early. A neighbor, maybe. Someone who could hold a chisel and little else." Mary knelt and unpacked the materials she'd brought from the inn, large sheets of paper, a flat piece of charcoal, and began, with careful, even strokes, to draw the shape of the carving up out of the stone and onto the page, white lines rising against dark ground like light coming through something. Her brow furrowed with the effort of an inscription 200 years worn. "Here lies the body of Elias Herrick, departed this life October 3rd, 1791, in the 44th year of his age. Remember me as you pass by, as you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you must be. Prepare for death and follow me." "Cheerful," Nancy said, one eyebrow going up, the dry look she gave things that amused her more than she wanted to admit. "They believed in being direct," Mary said. "There wasn't a lot of pastoral softening in 1791. Carol moved on to the next stone while Mary worked, her palm flat against its face, reading its shape before its words. "This one has something carved at the very top. Not letters, wider than a skull, and there's a texture to it, ridges, close together." Mary looked up from her rubbing. "Wheat," she said. "A sheaf of it, tied in the middle. Common enough on the later stones. It meant a long, full life. Somebody who'd lived to see harvest after harvest. I like that better than the skulls. Most people do, eventually." Nancy drifted further into the cemetery, reading as she went. Some of the stones were grouped in family clusters, parents and children, sometimes infants whose stones were so small and close together that she had to look twice to count them. The sheer quantity of children's graves, once you started noticing, was something you couldn't unnotice. Sacred to the memory of Hannah Herrick, wife of Josiah, who departed this life March 14, 1834. "She done what she could," Nancy read aloud. She stopped, and something crossed her face that was almost a wince, almost a smile, uncertain which one belonged there. "That's it. That's the whole thing." "She done what she could," Carol said without looking up from where her hands were working. "That might be the best epitaph I've ever heard." It has a kind of dignity to it, Mary agreed. Someone who knew her and wasn't going to oversell it. A smaller, older stone nearby, its slate gone thin as a dinner plate at one corner, caught Nancy's eye next. The lettering crude, clearly cut by the same unpracticed neighbor's hand as Elias Herrick's. Mother Bouvier, Nancy read, squinting. Died 1782. She paused, checked the line beneath it twice to be sure she had it right. I told you I was sick. Carol's head came up. It says what? I told you I was sick. That's the whole epitaph. No name beyond Mother Bouvier, no dates but the one. Nancy's mouth twitched, fighting a laugh that felt almost disrespectful to have in a place like this and coming anyway. Somebody buried her with the last word. I've never liked a stranger so much on so little information, Carol said. Nancy moved on. A stone near the back wall caught her eye next. Never than most, maybe 1880s, and the letters still clear enough to read without squinting. Captain Amos Herrick, lost at sea off the Grand Banks, November 1887, age 51. He was drowned, alas. Nancy paused, her mouth twisting sideways in that particular way she had when something struck her as both terrible and funny at once. He was drowned, alas. What kind of epitaph is that? A Maine one, Carol said. It's direct, Mary said. He was drowned. Alas. What else is there to say? You could say something about his character, his family, his... He was drowned, Carol said again, more firmly, a small, satisfied smile tugging at one corner of her mouth. Alas, that covers it. Nancy shook her head, but she was smiling too now, the whole shape of her face gone soft with it. She kept moving, threading between the stones, reading half to herself and half aloud. A small cluster near the wall made her stop entirely. 4 stones, close together, 3 small ones and 1 larger. The large one read, Lois Herrick, beloved wife of Richard, 1941 to 2009. She made everything better. The 3 small ones, around it like a constellation, each bore a different date, but the same year, 1967. 3 infants, 3 days apart. The names were worn but readable. James, Thomas, Ruth. Nancy stood for a moment. She didn't say anything. Her face had gone very still, the easy dryness of a minute ago folded away somewhere, replaced by something older and more careful. The look of a woman doing arithmetic she didn't want the answer to. 3 days apart, she thought, standing there with the wind moving through the sugar maples overhead, some fever or sickness that had come through a house and taken all of them before anyone could do anything at all. And some old dispatcher's habit in her kept building the call she'd never gotten to take. The frantic voice on the other end of a line that hadn't existed yet in 1967. The help that couldn't have come in time even if it had. She had spent 30 years being the calm at the other end of the worst nights of people's lives, and standing here in front of 3 small stones from a century she'd never touched, she felt for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and uselessly helpless. Then she moved on, but something in the quality of her silence changed, and it stayed changed. Carol, 20 feet away, had gone still herself, head tilted toward where Nancy stood. The charcoal had stopped scratching against Mary's paper somewhere behind her, and Nancy's own footsteps, the small, ordinary sounds of a person moving through a place, had simply stopped and not started again, and Carol had learned over 30 years of friendship to hear that particular kind of silence as clearly as she heard anything spoken aloud. Mary, Carol said quietly. Is she all right? Mary looked up from her rubbing, following the line of Carol's tilted head to where Nancy stood over the small cluster of stones, motionless. Her shoulders set in a way that told the whole story before Mary had even read the names herself. "I see it," Mary said softly. 3 infants. Same year, 3 days apart. She set down her charcoal. "Give her a moment." They worked on in the quiet, the wind picking at the edges of Mary's paper, and none of them said anything more about the 3 small stones because there wasn't really anything left to say. Chapter 15. Old Foundations. It was Nancy who spotted it. She'd been moving along the far wall, half reading the later stones, mostly marble, most of the names worn to near illegibility, when something across the road caught her eye. Not movement exactly, but the suggestion of structure where structure didn't quite belong. The way a straight line sits wrong in a landscape that's had 200 years to go crooked. Through the trees, maybe 40 yards back from the road, something had once stood here and was now only the idea of itself. She looked back at Mary and Carol. They were absorbed. Mary's charcoal moving in long strokes against a fresh sheet of paper, Carol's hands resting flat against the stone beside her, reading it ahead of the rubbing. It was the kind of focus that didn't need interrupting. "I'm going to look at something across the road," Nancy called. "I'll be back." Mary raised a hand without turning. Carol nodded once, her charcoal still moving. Nancy crossed the road and pushed into the tree line. The undergrowth was not bad, bare in places where the frost had already taken the ferns, the remaining bracken brown and ankle-high, the ground soft with years of fallen leaves. She moved toward the straight-line suggestion she'd seen. It was a foundation, or what remained of one, fieldstones set in a rough rectangle, the walls long since collapsed to rubble, the interior now a depression in the earth perhaps 5 feet deep, its edges hidden by decades of growth. The lilacs she'd noticed from the road were everywhere around it, their branches bare now but their forms still clear, domestic, deliberately planted, the kind that outlast everything else. Someone had grown lilacs here once, and roses, a low tangle of them gone wild and leggy, still throwing a few late blooms even now, impossibly in October, pale against the bare canes. Dooryard plants, both of them, the kind somebody sets by a front step, and the woods never quite managed to kill. Someone had cared about the approach to their door. She walked the perimeter, reading it the way she read most things, systematically, from the outside in. A house had stood here, small, probably 2 rooms. A well somewhere nearby, she thought, and there, yes, the depression of it, capped with a flat stone that had partly sunk. The old road from the farm to the main road would have come from the east. She could see the suggestion of a path in the way the trees thinned. She was so absorbed in the reconstruction of it, the way the dispatcher's part of her brain that could hear a crisis in a background sound also read a vanished life in a field, that she didn't see the cellar hole until she was in it. The edge gave way without warning. One moment she was walking, and the next the ground wasn't there. A step onto what looked like solid leaf-covered earth that was in fact the overgrown lip of the old foundation's interior, eroded and fragile and entirely unwilling to hold her weight. She went down hard, the 4 feet of drop not enough to kill you, but enough to do real damage on the way, her right shoulder catching the fieldstone edge, her head connecting with the far wall as she landed at the bottom. The impact was fast and then over, the way those things were. She lay still for a moment. Above her, the edges of the cellar hole framed a rectangle of gray October sky. A single red maple leaf detached from somewhere and drifted down into the hole with her, settling on the ground beside her head with a small final sound. She catalogued from long habit, intact but not fine. Head, ringing badly, vision slightly doubled. Right shoulder, significant pain. Probably not broken, but certainly not happy. Everything else, present and operational. She tried to sit up. The world tilted. She lay back down. "Well," she said to the rectangle of sky. And then she saw him. He was standing at the edge of the cellar hole at the far end, on the side closest to the road. The broad, scarred hands, the shoulders, the weathered face that had shown them a lobster split down the middle not 2 days ago and been quietly proud of it. Dickie. His face changed the instant he saw her. "Jesus, Nancy." He dropped to one knee at the edge. "Don't move. You hurt?" The relief was real and immediate. Of all the people to come along while she was folded into a hole in the ground, a person she'd actually met. "You have got the worst possible timing," she said, "and I have never been so glad to see anyone. Can you move anything?" His eyes ran over her quickly. Head, shoulder, legs, the practiced inventory of a man who had spent a lifetime around hooks, winches, cold water, and the kinds of accidents that did not wait for an ambulance. "Don't try to stand yet. Give me your left hand." She raised it toward him. He reached down without hesitation, closing his hand around hers. And her hand went through his, not glanced off, not missed. Through, the way your hand goes through the cold air over a pond, closing on nothing, her fingers folding into her own palm where his wrist should have been solid. Nancy looked at her hand, then at him. The air where his wrist should have been was exactly the same temperature as the air around it. Cold and ordinary and October. Nothing to mark the place where a solid thing should have stopped her. Dickie jerked his hand back. For a second he only stared at it. "That's not right," he said. He reached again, more carefully this time, aiming for her uninjured forearm. His fingers passed through her sleeve without disturbing it. "Hold still," he said, though there was strain in his voice now. "I've got you." But he didn't. He tried once more. Nothing. His face changed slowly. Not into fear exactly, not yet, but into the bafflement of a man whose hands had always done what he told them to do. He turned one hand over, frowning at it as though examining a tool that had worked his whole life and had just failed for no reason he could name. "That's been happening?" he said slowly. "I reach for things." He lowered his hand toward her shoulder deliberately. The way you'd test a burner you weren't sure was off. Her shoulder felt nothing. He drew back, and something crossed his face that looked almost like shame. The look of a proud man caught at something he couldn't help. "I can't work out why my hands won't take hold." "Concussion," said the part of Nancy's brain that had spent 30 years staying calm so other people could fall apart. "You hit your head on a fieldstone wall 4 feet down. Vision doubled, ears ringing. Now you're seeing a man you spent an afternoon with and your hand won't touch him because there's nothing there to touch. This is your skull, not the world." She believed it. She was a woman who had heard every kind of person swear to every kind of thing that turned out to be shock, or blood loss, or the mind doing its frantic best in a bad moment. She knew what she was. She was concussed and she was seeing things, and the thing she was seeing happened to be the nice old man from the wharf, because he was the last new face her rattled brain had filed. That was all. That was the whole of it. It did not explain why he looked so frightened. "You should sit down," she heard herself say gently, in the voice she'd used on the worst nights. "You don't look well." "I don't feel poorly," he said. "That's the strange part. I feel—" He searched, his eyes going somewhere past her, unfocused, the middle-distance look of a man trying to read a page that kept sliding out from under his eyes. "Like a morning you can't place. Like I've come out to the boat and can't recall the drive down." He looked at her, and for a moment the confusion cleared into something almost like appeal. his whole face opening. One person asking another to make sense of a thing. "Do you know, I can't rightly say how I got up here. To the burying ground. I come to see Lois, I always do, but I can't call up the walk of it." "Dickie," Nancy said carefully and did not finish. The question in her chest was one she had asked strangers 1,000 times down a phone line. "Sir, can you tell me where you are? Can you tell me what happened?" She could not make herself ask it now, because some animal part of her had started very quietly to be afraid of the answer. "You're kind," Dickie said unexpectedly. Something eased in his face when he said it, a small loosening around his eyes, an old man's smile trying to surface through the confusion. "You're down a hole with a bad wing and you're worried about me." Something eased in him a little. Lois was like that. Worst thing in the world could be happening, and she'd ask, "Had you eaten?" "Nancy," Mary's voice far off across the road. "Nancy!" The name reached down into the hole. Nancy turned her head toward it on instinct. "Here," she called, or tried to. Her voice did not carry the way she wanted. When she turned back, the edge of the cellar hole was empty. Just the lip of old fieldstone, the bare lilac branches, the flat gray rectangle of sky. "Dickie?" Nothing. A single red maple leaf detached from somewhere above and drifted down into the hole, settling on the ground beside her head with a small, final sound. "I'm here," Nancy said, when Mary's white face appeared at the rim above her. Carol, a half step behind with her cane already extended down into the hole, as though she could bridge the 4 feet by sheer will. "I'm not broken, mostly." "Don't move," Mary said, her face gone tight with the fear she wasn't bothering to hide, the open alarm of a woman who had raised children and knew exactly how fast 4 feet could become 40. "I wasn't planning to." "What were you doing back here?" "There was a house." It seemed very hard to explain suddenly. "There were lilacs. I wanted to see it." Mary was already on her phone, already doing the competent thing, her voice gone crisp and clear the way it did in an emergency, and Carol had gone still at the edge the way she had when she was listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. The tone of a person's voice, the thing under the words. Her whole face tilted downward into the hole, attentive as a held breath. "Nancy," Carol said quietly while Mary talked to whoever answered. "You said a name. Just now, when we came up, you said Dickie." Nancy lay looking at the rectangle of sky. The gray had not changed. It was the flat gray of a day that had decided what it was going to be and was not going to be argued with. "I hit my head," she said. "I'm seeing things." "All right," Carol said. She did not sound like a woman who thought that was all of it, her mouth pressed into a thin considering line, but she also did not push, because Mary was giving their location to a dispatcher 2 towns over, and there was a time for the other conversation, and this was not it. A second maple leaf drifted down to join the first. Nancy closed her eyes. Behind them, sharp and particular, and entirely unwilling to be filed away with the rest of the concussion, was the old man's face at the moment her hand passed through his. Not her fear. His. The way he looked at his own hand as though it had betrayed him. A man who did not know what was wrong with him. "I hit my head," she told herself again. "I'm seeing things." She held on to that the way she had once held on to voices. 30 years of voices. Voices calling from the far end of bad situations. Voices she had kept steady and calm by the simple discipline of her own voice staying steady and calm. She'd been good at that. She had been, without anyone ever saying so, one of the best. She held on to it until the dark came. Chapter 16. The Cold Side of the Bay. The inn's doctor was a semi-retired GP named Halliday, who came out to the cove twice a week and kept hours in a converted parlor 2 doors down from the post office, the waiting room furnished with the mismatched dignity of a place that had never once been redecorated on purpose. A horsehair settee, a jar of peppermints going soft at the register, framed photographs of boats that might have been his own once. He shone a light in Nancy's eyes, the beam sharp and cold against her retinas, asked her the day and the year and the name of the president, made her follow his finger left and right until the room swam faintly at the edges, and pronounced her concussed, but not dangerously so. "Mild," he said. "You'll have a headache tomorrow that'll make you wish it weren't. Someone should wake you a couple times tonight. Not because I think anything's wrong, but because it's cheap insurance. No screens, no bourbon." He looked at her over his glasses. "You'll want to be seeing things a little off for a day or two. Lights, edges, a face that isn't there now and then. That's the brain settling. Don't let it worry you." "A face that isn't there," Nancy repeated. "Sometimes people. Sometimes just a shape. It passes." He capped his penlight. "The mind doesn't like a blank. It fills them in. Rest is the only cure that's ever worked." Mary drove them back. Carol sat in the front and said little, which for Carol was itself a kind of statement. That night, Nancy dreamed, and the old man was in the dream. She knew it was a dream the way you always half know. The light was wrong. The cellar hole was there and then not there, and Dickie stood at the edge of it in his too thin clothes with the patience of a man waiting on a tide. Bowie was with him this time, the great black shape leaning against his leg. That was the detail that told her it was her own mind talking to her. Of course she'd dreamed the dog in. She'd liked the dog. The cold in the dream had a texture to it she didn't remember dreams usually bothering with. Not just an absence of warmth, but an actual weight against her skin. Damp and mineral. The specific cold of standing too near open water at the end of October. She could smell salt. She could hear, very faintly, a radio losing its station and finding it again. A thin thread of a voice rising and falling under static, though neither of them was standing anywhere near a radio. "You came back," Dickie said. He sounded relieved. "I wasn't sure you would." "I hit my head," Nancy told him, which seemed important to say even in the dream. "You're a concussion, the doctor said." "That may be," Dickie allowed. He didn't seem offended by it. He looked out over the dream water which came and went. "I keep trying to get down to the boat. I get part way and then I'm here instead. Or up to the burying ground with Lois." A pause. "I can't find Lois either. I thought she'd be here if anywhere. I keep looking." "Where's the boat?" Nancy asked. In the dream it seemed a reasonable question. "That's just it." He frowned, that same lost frown. "I know her mooring like my own hand. And I get out there and there's a piece missing. Between coming down the wharf and—" He stopped. "There's a piece missing, and I can't find the edge of it to take hold." "What's the last thing you remember?" He was quiet a long time. Bowie whined, low. "Working late," Dickie said finally. "Ear defenders on, the radio going. It was cold. I had my back to the—" And here his voice did the thing it had done in the cellar hole, went thin and strange, a signal losing itself. "I don't like this part," he said almost apologetically. "I don't like that I can't find it. A man ought to know where he's been." "It's all right," Nancy heard herself say, in the voice, the old steady one. "You don't have to find it tonight." "You're kind," he said again. And the dream thinned, the way they do, and let her go. She woke at 4 a.m. Mary, faithful to the doctor's orders, a hand on her shoulder, a glass of water. "What year is it? Who's the president?" And Nancy answered and lay back down and thought, "That's a vivid one. That's the concussion, doing exactly what the man said it would. She did not yet have the peace that would turn the dream into something else. She would have it by lunch. It came the way news comes in a small place. Not announced, just known, already in the air by the time you walk into it. They'd gone down to the diner for breakfast, the one with the propped door and the good coffee, and the room had the hush of a place where everyone is talking about one thing quietly instead of many things loudly. The waitress who'd been cheerful 2 mornings ago set down their coffee without quite her usual patter. Mary, who could read a room the way Carol read a countertop, caught it first. "Something's happened," Mary said low. It was the man in the next booth who said it, turning half around. The way people in small towns will fold strangers into a grief because grief is easier shared even with people who can't feel it. "You hear about Dickie Herrick? He didn't wait to find out. Found him in the water off his own wharf. 3-4 days back now. Went in off the boat, they're saying. Man hauled that ground 60 years. He shook his head at the wrongness of it. 60 years, and then you go and drown 20 feet from your own float. Don't seem possible. Nancy had gone very still. 3-4 days back. They had met him 2 mornings ago. No. She reached for the count, and it wouldn't hold still. They had come to the cove. The marine supply man had sent them to the wharf, and Dickie had shown them the traps and the gauge and the split lobster he'd kept back so they could see it, and Bowie had leaned his whole weight against a Carol at the top of the ramp, and Dickie had lifted one carved hand as they left. And then she'd gone up to the cemetery and fallen, and seen him at the edge of the cellar hole, reaching down to help her up, his hand passing through hers like cold air, his own face gone frightened because his hands wouldn't take hold. 3-4 days back. The wharf visit. The fall. She laid them against each other, and the order would not come right. Because here was the thing. Here was the thing she kept trying to set down and couldn't. She had seen him in the cellar hole after the wharf. She was sure of the wharf. And if the man had been 3-4 days dead, she stopped it there, deliberately, the way she'd once stopped a caller spiraling on a line. Not that. Not yet. One thing at a time. She was concussed. A doctor had looked in her eyes not 18 hours ago and told her in so many words that she would see a face that wasn't there. The mind doesn't like a blank. It fills them in. She had spent an afternoon with a kind old man, liked him, filed his face, his dog, his voice, the worn wood of his boat, and then she'd cracked her head on a fieldstone wall, and her rattled brain had reached into the drawer of recent faces and handed her the freshest one. Of course it had. That was not a haunting. That was a well-documented symptom, described to her in advance by a man with a penlight, the hand passing through hers, the dream, the frightened way he'd looked at his own fingers. Symptoms, she told herself. Harder now. All of it. The brain settling. She almost believed it. She was a woman who had spent 30 years believing the ordinary explanation, because the ordinary explanation was nearly always the true one, and the people who reached for the other kind were the people she'd spent 30 years talking down off the ledge of their own panic. She was not going to become one of them over a bump on the head, but she could not make the days line up, and there was a cold place under her breastbone that the concussion story did not warm. Nancy. Carol's hand had found her wrist on the table. Carol, who couldn't see her face, had heard the whole thing happen in the sound of her breathing. "You've gone somewhere. Come back." It wasn't the words that had told her, it was the gap between them. The specific silence of a person who has stopped breathing normally and started breathing carefully instead. Each inhale measured out like something rationed. And under it, so faint Carol wasn't certain anyone else at the table would have caught it at all. The small catch of a held sound trying to become a sentence, and failing. "I'm all right." Nancy made herself pick up the coffee, made her hand be steady doing it. "It's just, we met him 2 days ago, 3. He kept that lobster back so we could see it. That much was safe. That much was only grief, the ordinary kind, the kind you were allowed to feel in a diner. It's a hard thing to hear about a man you just shook hands with." "It is," Mary agreed softly. And Nancy let them think that was all it was. Let it stand as a sweet, sad coincidence. 3 tourists who'd had the strange luck to meet a man the week he died. Because the other thing, the thing about the cellar hole and the dream and the days that wouldn't line up, was not a thing she was ready to say out loud in the cold light of a Tuesday. Saying it out loud would make it a claim. And she was not yet, prepared to be a woman who made that claim. Mary looked down into her coffee for a moment, her fingers wrapped around the mug as if it were colder than it was. "He saved that lobster for us," she said quietly. "Do you remember? He was proud of it. Proud of every inch of that boat." Carol's hand remained over Nancy's wrist. "We remember." "You meet someone for half an hour," Mary said, almost to herself, "and then suddenly you understand they belong to an entire place. Everybody in here knew him." Nancy looked around the diner, the lowered voices, the faces that had gone solemn at the mention of his name, and felt the truth of it settle differently. Dickie had not been a stranger here. He had been part of the shoreline. She drank her coffee. Her head hurt, exactly as promised. The brain settling, she thought. That's all. She was still telling herself so when they walked out into the hard, bright morning, and the propped door let the low murmur of the room out after them. 60 years, 20 feet from his own float, don't seem possible. And something in her, the part that had always known when a caller was lying and when a quiet call was about to go bad, declined to be reassured. Chapter 17. The Locked Dock. It came the same way the first news had come. Not announced, just already in the air by the time they walked into it. 3 mornings after the first, the Cove having apparently used the interval to grieve properly, and then, in the way of small places, to find something to be busy about instead. They'd gone back to the same diner out of habit more than plan, and the waitress, Donna, her name tag said, though she'd never offered it aloud, set down their coffee with a briskness that had an edge to it this time. Not grief exactly. Something more like agitation looking for somewhere to land. "You hear," said the man in the next booth, the same one who'd told them about Dickie 3 mornings before, apparently self-appointed as the Cove's supplier of hard news to sympathetic strangers. "They took Junior Greenleaf in this morning." Nancy set her cup down carefully. "Junior, Dickie's, Everett Greenleaf, runs the Notalata. Him and Dickie's been at each other's throats for 40 years. Whole village knows it." The man shook his head, not with satisfaction exactly, more the relish of a person handed a story with a shape already in it. "Found some of Dickie's own buoys tied up at Junior's dock. Sheriff had to come down and take him in for it." "Buoys," Mary repeated. "Dickie's colors. Red and yellow. Right there at Junior's own float, plain as you like." He spread his hands, a man laying out a case he considered closed. Man practically confessed by leaving it out where God and everybody could see it. Donna, refilling a mug 2 booths down, said without turning around, "Don't seem like Junior, though, does it? Whatever else you say about him." "Don't seem like much of anybody," the man said, "but there it is." He went back to his eggs, the matter settled in his own mind, and the diner's low murmur closed back over the topic the way water closes over a dropped stone. Already moving on, already reaching for the next thing, because grief in a place this size only had room to hold one shape at a time, and the shape had just changed from terrible accident to somebody did this, and a somebody was so much easier to carry than a nobody. Nancy sat very still, turning her coffee cup a slow quarter turn on its saucer, the old habit surfacing before she decided to let it. Found tied up at his own dock. Plain as you like. 30 years of listening to people confess things by accident had left her with an instinct for the sound of a story that had been handed to somebody rather than lived by them. And this one had that sound. Too clean, too available, evidence sitting out in the open exactly where it would do the most damage to the one person everybody already had 40 years of reasons to suspect. "That's strange," she said half to herself. "What is?" Mary asked. "If you'd just killed a man over a territory dispute," Nancy said slowly, "and you were smart enough to have done it and not been caught doing it, would you really tie the evidence to your own dock, where anyone walking by would see it?" "Maybe he panicked," Mary said. "Maybe." Nancy didn't sound like she believed it. But panic usually looks messier than that. Panic hides things badly, in a hurry, someplace close to hand. It doesn't usually leave things out where they're guaranteed to be found. Carol, who had gone very quiet over her own coffee, said, "You sound like you don't think he did it." "I don't know what I think," Nancy said, which was true, and also not quite the whole truth, because some old, well-trained part of her had already begun, without her permission, sorting the story into background and signal. The way she'd sorted 1,000 calls before this one, and the signal she kept landing on was the same 3 words, turning over and over. Too clean. Too available. They walked down toward the water after breakfast, none of them quite deciding to, the way a person's feet sometimes knew the plan before the rest of them caught up. The wharf where Dickie's boat sat, Lil Miss Lois, still tied at her mooring, nobody having yet had the heart or the authority to move her, was quiet in the flat gray light, gulls working the pilings, the tide low and the mud flats exposed and glistening. And there, at the very head of the ramp, sitting with the stillness of a creature that has chosen its post and intends to keep it, was Bowie. He didn't come to them right away. He sat with his great black head up, ears pricked toward the water, watching the mouth of the cove with an attention that had nothing casual in it at all. The look, Nancy thought, of someone waiting for a particular engine among all the ordinary sounds of a harbor. Someone who had learned to sort one boat's note out of 100 and was still doing it days later, though the boat that note belonged to would never come around the point again. Nancy had spent 30 years listening to people wait for things that weren't coming. A caller holding the line for a fire truck already 3 minutes out. A mother refusing to hang up until the ambulance turned onto her street, and she knew that particular quality of waiting when she saw it now, dog or not. It wasn't hope, exactly. It was something more disciplined than hope, a vigil kept out of loyalty rather than expectation, the kind of waiting that didn't need to believe the thing would happen in order to keep doing it anyway. "Oh," Carol said softly when Mary described it to her. "Oh, that poor animal." A woman came out of the house nearest the ramp, wiping her hands on her apron, and seeing them looking, called over, not unkindly, "That's Dickie's dog. Ed and I took him in, first few days seemed the thing to do. But he won't stay put. Slips out the second the doors open and comes right back down here." She looked at the dog with an expression that mixed real fondness with real helplessness. "Ed found him down here at 5 this morning. Sitting just like that. Been doing it every day. I don't know what to do for him except let him sit." "He won't hardly eat either," the woman added, twisting the dish towel between her hands. "Picks at it. Big dog like that ought to be finishing a whole bowl in a minute flat, and he's leaving half of it. Some days more than half. Ed keeps saying, 'Give it time.' Animals grieve same as people, but it's hard to watch. Harder still with nobody sure yet who's got the right to say what happens to him long term." May we, Carol started. Go on. He's gentle as anything. Just sad. Carol crossed to him slowly, Kane finding the ramp's edge, and Bowie turned his head at the sound of her, and something in his posture eased, just slightly, as she lowered herself down onto the boards beside him and let her hand find the broad plane of his skull. He leaned into it, all 140 pounds of him, with a low sound that wasn't quite a whine and wasn't quite a sigh. He's listening for something, Carol said very quietly, her fingers moving in slow circles behind his ear. You can feel it in him. He's not just sitting here, he's waiting. Nobody said anything to that. Out past the mouth of the cove, an ordinary lobster boat went by, its engine note rising and falling with the swell, and Bowie's ears tracked it, alert, hopeful, and then went slack again as it passed on by toward somebody else's wharf. Carol's hand had gone still on his head, feeling the exact moment hope left him, and disappointment settled back in, the two things passing through his body like weather. He does this every time, she said quiet. I can feel it. His whole body comes up like a question mark, and then it just deflates. Every single time it isn't the right boat. I don't know how many times a day that happens to him, but I'd guess it's more than any of us could stand to do on purpose. Come on, old fellow, Carol murmured, so quiet it was almost not meant for the rest of them at all. Come on, you can keep waiting. I'll sit here as long as you need me to. Bowie stood then, unhurried, and instead of settling back against her side the way he had every other time, he took 2 slow steps toward a low, shingled shed at the base of the ramp, stopped, and looked back at her, the deliberate patience of an animal used to being followed by someone slower than himself. He wants me to go somewhere, Carol said, surprised. It's just his old gear locker, the woman called over. Dickie kept spare line and buoy paint and whatnot in there. Doors never locked, nothing worth taking. Carol let him lead her the short distance, her free hand trailing along the shed's rough board siding, and Bowie pressed his nose to the gap beneath the door and made a low sound in his throat. Not quite a whine, before sitting squarely in front of it and looking up at her expectantly. Inside, when Mary worked the latch and let the door swing open, there was nothing more dramatic than a workbench, coiled spare line, a shelf of half-used paint cans, and, hanging from a nail by the door, at exactly dog-nose height, a worn leather collar too small for Bowie's own neck. That was the pup before him, the woman said, coming up behind them, her voice gone soft. Old dog, gone 8, 9 years now. Dickie never could bring himself to throw the collar out. Bowie goes and smells it most days, I think. Some kind of comfort in it, maybe. The same way we keep pictures. Carol found the collar by feel, the leather gone soft and cracked with age, and held it a long moment without saying anything at all, and Bowie leaned his whole weight against her legs, patient, grateful, in no hurry to leave. Nancy stood at the top of the ramp a while longer, watching the dog's ears work the water, and thought about a story that was too clean and too available, and a man in a cell who had carried another man's wife to her grave, and felt the same cold, familiar certainty settle into her chest that she'd felt 100 times before on the other end of a bad call. That something here had been arranged, and arranged badly by someone who had not expected anyone patient enough to look twice. Chapter 18. Garrett and Company. The Garrett and Company pound sat where the working wharf met the marina, a long, low building with a take-out window at one end and, running through the middle of it, a public walkway the owners had clearly built with tourists in mind, holding tanks on both sides, thick with dark seawater, and in the tanks, banded and stacked and shifting slowly over one another, more live lobsters than Nancy had ever seen in one place in her life. Good heavens, Carol said, who could not see them but could hear the aerators bubbling and smell the cold brine of it. How many are in there? Hundreds, Mary said. Thousands, maybe. She leaned over the rail. Look at the size of that one in the corner. He must be older than I am. They can live to 100, Nancy said. The big ones are usually the old ones. Some of these have been crawling around down there since before we were born. They walked the length of the tank slowly, the way you walked through an aquarium, the light coming green and wavering off the water, and came out the far end into the open air behind the building, where the gravel yard gave onto a view that stopped all three of them where they stood. The cove opened out below them, the tide full, the whole far hillside gone to October. Rust and amber and burnt gold against the black green of the spruce. Every bit of it doubled in the still water so that the world seemed to have twice as much color in it as it needed. A few gulls hung in the air over the wharf. Somewhere below, a bell buoy rang, slow and unhurried. "Oh," Carol said when Mary described it to her. "Oh, that's worth the trip right there." Below them at the marina, the docks were nearly empty. A few slips held small pleasure craft buttoned up under canvas for the season, and at the far end a young couple was climbing gingerly into a rented kayak while a teenager in a hoodie held the dock line and gave instructions. A rack beside the little rental shed held a row of bicycles and a hand-painted sign. Kayaks, canoes, bikes by hour or day. But the working part of the dock, the part where the lobster boats tied up, held only 2. "That's strange," Nancy said before she'd quite decided to say anything. "What is?" 2 boats, in a lobstering village, in the middle of the afternoon. She nodded down at them, though Carol couldn't follow the gesture and Mary had to find them herself. "Everybody else is out on the water. That's where you'd be, this time of day, this time of year. But those 2 are just sitting there." Nancy knew the nearer one before she'd finished the thought that she knew it. Dark green hull, the raised white letters along the bow, the worn pale rail she'd watched Carol's hand find not 3 days ago. Lil Miss Lois. Tied up, idle. Nobody on her deck, nobody reheading a trap, no radio playing to no one at all. And just beyond her, the crooked homemade lettering she'd have known anywhere now. Not a lotta. "Those are theirs," Nancy said quietly before she could stop herself. "Dickie's and Junior's." Mary went very still. "Both of them." "Both of them," Nancy agreed. 2 boats that ought to be out working a good afternoon, sitting exactly where they'd left them at the wharf. One because there was no one left to take her out, and one because the law had a man's hands full of other things. They stood a moment longer, and Nancy looked at the 2 idle boats a beat past what the view really called for, the dispatcher's reflex, the same quiet itch at wrongness that had never once in 30 years been wrong about anything that mattered, and then a low diesel rumble came around the point, and a 3rd lobster boat swung in toward the wharf, riding low, a man in orange oilskins standing at the stern among a deck full of traps and totes. "Now that's more like it," Mary said, and they watched the boat come in, watched the deckhand throw a line, watched crates of just-caught lobsters swung up onto the dock, still dripping, one of them catching the light. It was a good thing to watch, competent and old and unbothered by them, the same motions done the same way for 200 years. As they turned back toward the pound, a wiry man in his 50s came down the ramp from the parking area, a canvas tool bag over his shoulder and Mid-Coast Marine Electronics stitched on his jacket, and was met at the bottom by an older man in a harbor master's cap. "Nothing yet," the harbor master said, before the repairman had even asked. "Same as last week. I've got the part sitting in my van, Cliff. It's a 2-hour job. I hate carrying an open ticket this long. Nothing I can do for you. Boat's just sitting there. Nobody can lay a hand on her till it's all sorted. And with Dickie gone, Lord knows when that'll be, or who ends up with her." The harbor master shook his head. Garrett says he'll let you know soon as anything's settled. Says he's keeping on top of it. Garrett'll let me know. The repairman repeated it in a voice carefully scrubbed of anything you could call it out for. All right then. He shouldered his bag back up the ramp. The harbor master went the other way. And Nancy, who had stopped without deciding to and let the exchange wash over her, filed it away in the drawer that didn't have a label yet, Garrett'll let you know, and said nothing at all. They walked on, around the seaward side of the building toward the picnic tables, the gravel giving way to a patch of packed dirt and tough seagrass, and it was there, Carol a half step off Nancy's elbow, tapping along easy and unworried, that the cane caught something. It struck low and solid with a hollow wooden knock, and Carol pitched forward. Nancy had her by the arm before she'd gone 6 inches, and Mary's hand was at her other side a half-second later. "I've got you." "Well," Carol said, resettling herself, more startled than anything. "What in the world was that?" Nancy looked down. A stack of lobster pots, 3 of them and a couple of buoys, shoved up against the side of the building where the gravel ran out. The kind of gear that sat around every working dock in the world, waiting to go back in the water or to the dump. Nothing anyone would look at twice. "Just some traps," she said. "Somebody left their gear piled up where a person could break their neck on it." "On a working wharf," Mary said, "everything is everywhere, and all of it is in the way. You get used to it or you go home." Carol laughed, tapped her cane once around the offending pile to fix its position in her mind, and they moved on to the nearest table, and none of them looked twice at the gear, and none of them saw the smear of fresh red and yellow the buoy had left along the white tip of Carol's cane. Lunch, when they'd fetched it from the window, was worth every mile they'd flown for it. Lobster rolls cold style and mayonnaise light, the meat sweet and piled past reason on grilled buns, and for Mary, alone in her enthusiasm, a small tub of tamale she spread on crackers she'd produced from her purse, because of course Mary traveled with crackers. "That's the liver," Nancy said. "I want it on record that you're eating the liver. I'm eating the best part, is what I'm doing. Chris loves it too. He'd have this whole tub gone before I finished one cracker." She fitted the lid back on after her third with visible regret, which is precisely why I'm stopping. Too much temptation in one sitting. The rest goes in the room refrigerator, and I get to look forward to it all week. "There was a fiddlehead on a menu in town," she went on to Carol as they ate. "That little cafe by the water. I nearly ordered it just to see. Fern shoots. They pick them wild in the spring, only good a few weeks in May. This time of year they'd be from frozen, so I let it be. But fresh, in season, people up here swear by them. A greener, wilder asparagus, supposedly." "We'll have to come back in May," Nancy said. "Don't tempt me." The afternoon settled around them, warm in the sun and sharp in the shade the way October did, and beneath the ordinary sounds of the place, the forklift, the hose, the gulls negotiating, there ran another sound Nancy heard without knowing she was hearing it. The dry, rhythmic squeak of a winch somewhere behind the building, metal on metal, patient as a slow heartbeat. At the next table, 2 women in fleece vests were splitting a whoopie pie the size of a hamburger, and a piece of their talk drifted over on the breeze. "Due in the spring," they're saying. "Wendy's whole family's beside themselves. Her mother's already got the needles out." "That was quick. Didn't she just marry the Grindle boy?" "June. Nobody's counting on their fingers out loud anyhow." Nancy caught the small knowing curl of Carol's mouth and matched it. The same sister, the same spring baby, come round again on the cove's gossip like a tide. There was something almost warming in hearing it twice, as if the village had decided without quite meaning to let them in on its news. They were most of the way through lunch when a man came out of the pound's side door, 30s, sweatshirt, the settled anger of someone continuing an argument rather than starting one, with one of Garrett's countermen a step behind him. "Half," the lobster man said. "You're telling me half." "I'm telling you what I was told, Ronnie. Half now, and the rest soon as the next container ships out. That's what I've got to give you. I hauled that catch 3 days ago. I've got fuel to pay for and a sternman to pay, and neither one of 'em runs on soon as the next container ships out." The man dragged a hand down his face. "It didn't used to be like this. You brought your catch, you got your check. That was the whole of it. I know it. Tell him I need the rest by Friday. Not soon. Friday." And he went up the ramp toward the lot, and the counterman stood a moment looking at nothing, and then went back inside. Nancy wrapped both hands around the last of her coffee and looked out at the cove, where the tide had just started, imperceptibly, to turn. In the drawer without a label, quietly, another few things found their places and lay there waiting. 2 boats idle on a working day, a dead man's boat that only Garrett could speak for, and a pound so short of money it was paying its fishermen in halves. None of it was anything. Any one piece of it was nothing at all. She had spent 30 years knowing the difference between nothing and not yet something. "We should get on," Carol said, folding her napkin by feel. "You wanted to rest that head of yours this afternoon, and lunch won't finish resting it for you." They cleared their table like the women their mothers had raised, and walked back up toward the car through the green light of the lobster tanks, talking about whether a whoopie pie would survive in a suitcase. And behind them the cove went on shining, and the winch went on squeaking, and the fresh paint dried slowly along the tip of Carol's white cane. Back at the inn that evening, with the light going long and gold across the harbor, and the 3 of them settled in the sitting room off the lobby, Mary, with her tamale and crackers rationed onto a saucer, Nancy with a glass of the Pinot Grigio she'd talked the innkeeper out of, Carol with her shoes off and her feet up and a bourbon she'd earned, Nancy noticed the cane. It was leaning against the arm of Carol's chair, and along the white tip, where the rubber met the shaft, was a smear of color. She leaned in without quite thinking about it. "You've got paint on your cane," she said. "I've got what?" "Paint, red and yellow. Right down at the tip." Nancy reached over and rubbed at it with her thumb. A little came off, tacky, and left a faint stain on her skin. "It's those traps you tripped over back at the pound. Somebody must have just painted their buoys and left the whole pile sitting there for a blind woman to walk into." "Well, that's marine gear for you," Carol said, wiggling her toes. "I'll wear the evidence proudly. Hazard pay. I'll get a rag and some water, get it off before it sets. Leave it till morning. I'm not moving from this chair for anything short of the building being on fire, and possibly not even then." Carol took a slow sip of her bourbon. Let a woman rest her feet. So Nancy left it, and wiped her thumb on her napkin, and thought no more about it than you'd think about paint on a cane, which is to say, not at all. It was a smudge. It was the sort of thing that happened on a dock. Outside, the last of the sun let go of the water, and the 3 of them talked of other things, of whoopie pies and popovers, and whether Mary's tamale would keep the week, of what a person might still turn up in a 200-year-old cellar hole if they ever found the nerve to go back and look properly. And the cane leaned in the corner with its bright little band of wrong, waiting, the way some things wait, to mean something later.